This is Damian Macy from the Marshall Library Oral History Project. I am here today on Monday, December the 29th, interviewing one of our local residents, Mr. Steve Arney, who had lived here as a youngster and moved away and then returned back to Marshall. So with that, I'll introduce Steve.
Good morning. Good to be here.
Are there any particular things in your past that you remember that you would like to say about Marshall? Maybe just say where you're born, your parents, and there's some things to talk about.
Well, I was a Depression baby, born December 7th, 1937, on a farm on Old Route 40, just about a mile west of Casey, in Cumberland County. I was the last of 5 children, and I think it was kind of a surprise to my parents, actually, since there was several years between my next brother and myself. In any case, we lived there on the farm, and my dad worked at the shoe factory in Casey and also did a little farming. One of the few things I remember from living there was being in the cornfield with my dad and my 3 older brothers. They were hand shucking ears of corn off the stalks and throwing it in a wagon pulled by a horse. And my job was to pick up the ears that they missed the wagon with and put them back in. In any case, we moved from there in October of 1942 because my dad got a job at Velsico. So that was my first small child. I really don't remember a lot about those early years, except, I started the first grade when I was 5 years old. There was no kindergarten in Marshall at the time. I would have been 6 in December. And at the old Southside School. And I remember in the 2nd grade having Ruth Friedenberger, a longtime teacher at Marshall. And one of the more poignant things I remember about that experience was Franklin Delano Roosevelt died when I was in the 2nd grade, and she was very, very emotional about his death. I remember her being very, very sad that whole day, and actually tilting the flag over at a 45-degree angle to kind of represent half-staff. In the middle of the 3rd grade, my parents moved to the north side of town, so I transferred to the north side, and Irene Klein was the 3rd grade teacher at the north side. Long-time teacher also. Continued on through the 6th grade at the north side, and then my class was the first junior high class in Marshall. Prior to that time, all 8 grades went to either the north side or the south side, but beginning the year I was in the 7th grade, we moved out to the high school complex, and the 7th grade was in what was remained of the old high school building that had not been torn down, and the 8th grade was in the north end of the new high school building. So went to the north side, or the 7th grade in the old building, and the 8th grade in the new building. Graduated from high school in 1955, and Marshall at that time was quite a bit different than it is today.
More lively.
Yeah, more lively. The candy kitchen was in full swing, and that's where all the high school kids hung out. It was a good experience. I lived at 606 North 9th Street, which is a little short street that begins at Spruce and goes then on up past Mulberry, up into the north end of town. Beyond, remembering that, I remember walking to high school, cutting through the Gecklers' yard. The Gecklers lived directly behind us on 8th Street, and then there was a cinder street between 8th and 7th that went past where Jott and Virginia Malloy lived, and then on down across that block to the high school. So it was a pretty short walk. But there were no school buses for city kids then like there are today. Everybody walked if you were able.
There were buses then for the country students?
Yes, the country students.
I remember when those began.
Yeah, it was at about that time, I think, the country schools were closing, and they all, in fact, came into to junior high. I'm not sure if they all closed at the same time or what, but I know my first meeting with some of my classmates, like Leland Shirley and some other, maybe Eleanor Mealing, your wife. That was my first meeting with those folks. They live in the country.
I kind of think they phased those out, but it was a pretty close period of time together, so that they pretty much all ended up in school at about the same time.
Right. Thanks.
Those neighborhoods that you lived in, both in the country and here in town, has there been major changes from then to now, if you see those?
Well, the house I was born in no longer exists, of course, but the house I lived in Marshall, they've both been remodeled. The one we lived in on the south side has been added on to several times, and the one on 9th Street has been remodeled also. So, those were old houses then, and they're still old houses, but they're newer old houses.
In your high school, are there particular things that you remember about students or events that are really vivid in your mind?
Well, I remember knowing the high school kids, being in junior high out in the high school complex, let you know the high school kids a little better, and they knew who you were and so forth. So I probably had a better recognition of who some of those folks were that graduated, say, in the late 40s, early 50s, than I otherwise would have. I know when I was a freshman, the Korean War was going on, and so there were some Marshall boys who were in Korea at that time. So I remember that. I remember my uncle Vaughn was the music director, so he got me started on musical instruments fairly early, and started on the clarinet. I also took piano lessons for a while, and then he decided I ought to play the cornet in high school instead of the clarinet, so that's what I played throughout the high school years. Enjoyed that.
I remember your Uncle Vaughn very distinctly, and also your Aunt Catherine.
Yes.
They were just fine folks and very good friends of my parents.
Yes. Aunt Catherine was the librarian for a while. My dad worked at Valsa Coal during those years, and worked shift work, and I remember he hated to work midnight shift because he couldn't sleep during the day. So 6 days of midnights made him pretty grumpy towards the end of that shift. Yeah. Plus
What?
Plus, he had an ulcer, so he was not able to eat a lot of the things that he would like to have eaten. And of course, in those days, there really was no cure for an ulcer. So he just had to watch when he soft foods and things like that.
In the years past and since the closing of Elsico, we've heard a lot of comments about, oh, what a dangerous place it was and all of that, but was there any feeling of that at the time he worked there?
Any feeling of what?
Uneasiness about the chemicals and things that he was working with?
No, not that I recall. Just the smell. I remember he would come home with the Velsico smell on his clothes, and Mother would make him change on the back porch before he could come in the house. One thing I do remember about Velsico is that one morning early, the siren went off, and two of my brothers, older brothers, I think worked there at the time, and were living with us at home. And they jumped up out of bed and put on clothes and went out to Velsico because it was on fire. And fortunately, they were able to put it out without extensive damage, but there were a couple of injuries, pretty severe injuries. I remember Charlie Pruitt, I remember getting burnt pretty badly. And I had to have a couple of photographs. I don't know where they came from. Aerial photographs of it on fire, which I recently gave to Brad Parker. I thought he might be able to do something with them.
It was a major industry for Marshall for so many, many, many years.
Yes, it was. It employed a lot of people.
Oh my, sure did. In your school, you mentioned your graduation. What happened then, Steve?
Well, what happened was that I got a scholarship to DePaul University in Greencastle, Indiana. And, but unfortunately, I was not really ready for college. Starting at school when I was 5 kind of put me in the wrong class, actually, maturity-wise. Looking back, I have determined this. And so I really, I had it easy in high school, didn't have to really work very hard to get good grades. But that wasn't the case at DePaul. So I spent much more time with recreational activities than I did with reading books. So, and I had to maintain I think they're on a 4-point grade scale, so I had to maintain a 3-point average to keep the scholarship. And unfortunately, I came in at 2.9, I think. So I got a letter saying, we're going to suspend your scholarship for the next semester. But if you get your grades up, then we'll resume it. Well, unfortunately, we couldn't afford to pay full tuition and room and board for that one semester. So I transferred to Indiana State, lived at home, and went to Indiana State for my second year, and was very unsure at that time about what I wanted to do with college, what I wanted to major in, what direction I wanted to go, and so forth. So I was talking to Dick Foreman. Dick Foreman was a couple years behind me and had just graduated from high school, and he wanted to go into the Army. And so we talked about that, and I decided, well, I'd just go in the Army too. So we both enlisted for 2 years and left in July of 1957 for Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri. So spent 2 years in the Army, was fortunate to get assigned to Germany after basic training, and had a very good duty assignment in Germany.
It had to be better than Fort Leonard Wood.
Oh yeah, it was over 100 in July at Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri. So spent 2 years in the Army, got out, came back, resumed going to Indiana State, and got my degree in 1961.
In what field?
Yeah, in business administration. Still wasn't sure what I wanted to do, but that's what I wound up with. And so got a job with J.B. Pfister and Company in Terre Haute, who was in the real estate business primarily, and also was getting started in the insurance business. And so they wanted to expand. They had a 3-person staff in the insurance business, and they wanted to expand that. And so I hired on with them and worked about 9 months with them when, and the company at that time was operated by 4 brothers. Well, I got called me in the office one day and said, unfortunately, one of the sons of one of the brothers had failed out of Indiana University and needed a job. And they deemed that he could do my job. So they laid me off. And so that was my experience with J.B. Pfister and Company. So then I decided, that was about the time that John F. Kennedy had made his inaugural address about do something for your country instead of waiting for your country to do something for you. So I thought, well, maybe I should go to work for the federal government. So I applied, sent in my application, and sure enough, went to work for the Social Security Administration. I spent 35 years, and so it was from that time until I retired that I was away from Marshall. So what went on in Marshall was not something that I was fully aware of all the time.
Your period of time with the Social Security Administration, that was not in Terre Haute, was it?
No, it wasn't. It was very.
Did you have several different assignments then?
Yeah, I worked in Springfield, Illinois, Indianapolis, Muncie, Indiana, Valparaiso, Indiana, and then in Chicago, wound up in Chicago the last 25 years.
I think somewhere in there, you acquired a wife, I think, too, didn't you?
Yes, I did. Married Carol Lewis, a local girl whose father worked at Simpson Kepler Chevrolet as a mechanic for a while. Then he also operated a couple of filling stations. And the last part of his career, his working career, was at the post office. He was a mail carrier for quite a while. Walked about 15, 16 miles every day back in those days. They didn't have those little vehicles then that they do now. And so Carol and I got married in 1963. So she traveled around the various towns we lived in all that time. Marshall, I kept track of Marshall because my parents, well, my dad had passed away, but my mother still lived here. Carol's folks lived here. So we kept up reading the Marshall paper, whichever one it was. It changed over the years from the Herald to the Democrat, or maybe both of those papers existed at the same time.
Together, or separate.
Yeah. Read one or the other of them. And then when they both went out of existence, the McCammons came and started a paper, and so I read the Marshall Choice and so forth, so I kept up on what was going on in Marshall. One of the things that impressed me about Marshall in those years, say in the 80s, was reading about efforts of some folks to update Marshall, or keep it going, keep the buildings in good shape and so forth. Programs like Marshall Main Street and Marshall in Motion told me that there were people in Marshall who were progressive and wanted to wanted it not to fall down like some other small rural towns were doing.
The Main Street organization pretty well started as a feeling of what we wanted to do in about 1993. It didn't become official, and I think actually chartered until about 97. But the idea started back in the very early 90s.
Mm-hmm. Well, in any case, that was one of the factors that influenced Carol and I just to decide to move. When I retired, to move to Marshall instead of somewhere else, Florida or a little more exotic retirement locations. So we thought, we'd move to Marshall and maybe help a little bit if we could, and also look after her parents and my mother, who was very elderly at the time.
That decision, had you ever wavered from that after you moved back here and saying, oh gosh, I don't know if this was the right thing or not?
Yeah, it's entered my mind. I don't know if it has Carol so much, but when we visit we did some traveling, and so when you get to other locations in other parts of the country, there are really some nice places to live in the United States, and so yeah, I kind of thought maybe it would have been nice to live in San Luis Obispo, California, or
but Marshall won out.
Marshall, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a pretty good place. That's what we felt when we moved back. In that period of time, was there a person that you can really say helped steer your career or some of your decisions that was really an influence on you?
Way back when?
Anywhere.
Well, yeah, actually, I wanted to go to the University of Illinois when I graduated from high school. But my dad influenced me not to go there because he had gone 1 year there during World War I. At the start of World War I, he had just graduated from high school. So he went 1 year and unfortunately got ill with rheumatic fever, so he was not able to go back. But he told me that that's too big a place for a little small town guy like you. You just get lost and you wouldn't feel content. And so, but yeah, he influenced me that way. And I've always kind of regretted that. Actually, I would have liked to. I'd like to be a graduate of the University of Illinois. But in any case, Reverend Porteous, who was the Methodist minister of the First United Methodist Church at the time, Alex Porteous, he influenced me to go to DePaul. In fact, it's a Methodist affiliated college. So he didn't decide, but he highly recommended that I go there. Beyond that, I can't think of any one individual who influenced anything in my career path.
You mentioned a couple names. One was Franklin Roosevelt and another one Kennedy and all. Is there a particular event that you can think about over your lifetime that really stands out or just such a vivid memory?
That's a hard one. Well, I can remember the end of World War II. I can remember going out in the street and doing a jig, with some of the playmates that lived in the neighborhood. And I can remember my brothers. I had two brothers. My two oldest brothers were both in the service during the war. And I remember them coming home and that being a very happy, joyous time. My mother was always so proud of that. Had the banner hanging in the window with the 2 stars on it. And, also, I had my sister was the oldest in the family, and her husband was actually killed on Okinawa. And I remember during the war, this would have been 1945, May of 45, my dad waking up, my brother and I, in the middle of the night, saying we got to go to Casey, because Rosemary just got a telegram that her husband had been killed.
Does the conveniences that we have today, I mean, we've got dishwashers, we've got garage door openers, all of these things. And you talked about when you were a youngster, dealing with the horse in the field. Are there some of these conveniences that you really say have helped change your life and your attitudes, maybe?
Oh, yeah. I can remember when we lived down in the South Florida town, when I was just a little guy. We had the heat was a coal stove, and I would pull a wagon up to Newberry's. Remember Newberry's?
My dad worked there.
Yeah, and I can't remember what's there right now. But in any case,
it's really the convenience store, Casey's.
Yeah, okay.
In the front part of it, in the front of that.
In any case, pull a wagon up there and get a gunny sack full of corn cobs, which we'd use to start the fire with.
Did you soak them in kerosene, or at that time we called coal oil?
They didn't let me handle that part of it. My job was just to go get them. But I remember that. I also remember then my mother, we had an old Maytag washer. And it had a motor on it to do the churning, but to dry the clothes, I hung them on the line, of course, but it had a wringer. I don't know if you know what a wringer is, a roller, two rollers, and you run the clothes and hand crank the rollers to squeeze as much water out of them as possible, and that was my job, was to turn the crank. And another thing I remember is you didn't go to the store and buy a chicken. You had your own chickens, and you'd have to cut the head off the chicken and let it run around to bleed, and then have boiling water, soak the chicken in the boiling water, and get your feathers off.
As I remember as a youngster, my mother doing that, I couldn't think of a much more evil smell than those wet feathers.
I know, yeah. I hated to pluck the feathers off those chickens, but that's what, back in those days, every kid had a job around the house, so chores to do, and so I'm not sure it's that way anymore with all the conveniences that people have today.
You mentioned some of these things, and kids would just look at you with a blank stare of, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
Even like, how did you live without a television set?
Exactly, yeah.
How did you live without a cell phone? With all of these things, Steve, you've mentioned really some very, very interesting things, and I think that's the purpose of this, of what people remember. And you said Marshall used to be a lot more active and lively place. Then that's kind of what brought you back, was the revival of Marshall, maybe. Mm-hmm. How do you think our downtown and our business environment, maybe even the whole city, compares now to when you were a youngster?
Well, it's very attractive. The town is very attractive, I think, comparatively. Excuse me. With work that, as a result of the efforts of people like yourself and others who have spurred the city council and the city administration to seek funding that resulted in the improvements of the sidewalks and the streets and lamp posts and so forth and so on. So it's a very attractive town. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of business downtown, and that's partially the result of Walmart coming to town and establishing a supercenter, which in one sense is good for Marshall in terms of the sales tax revenue it brings from people from out of town coming here to shop. But it's not a good thing for the downtown of Marshall in terms of from a business standpoint, I guess. There's just not a good way to make a living with a storefront business on Archer Avenue right now.
You were very much part of a project called Harlan Hall. You helped a great deal in physical and serving on that committee. Would you kind of elaborate on that maybe a little bit?
Well, Harlan Hall was quite a project, and I think it's a great thing that it happened. It was very controversial. There was a faction in town that thought it ought to be torn down, that it wasn't worth the effort and money it would take to revitalize it and make it what it is today. So I'm glad to have been on the side that resulted in it being what it is today. I'm also pleased, I must say, by the fact that the current administration seems to be interested in keeping it going. I had some doubts about that at the time, but so far it seems to be working out reasonably well. It was a lot of work, there's no question, and I put in some hours, not nearly as much as others, and I would like to specifically mention Jim Schwartz, who I think if we hadn't had him, it probably wouldn't have happened, because his leadership and his ability and his skills was just played a tremendous part.
And Ben Hammond was another one too. He had a lot of the wherewithal and knowledge about how to do this or that and help us along.
Exactly, yeah. We needed some people like that. We just didn't, people like you and I could drive nails and maybe paint a little bit, but we didn't have the expertise that it took, that they had.
Well, Steve, it's been interesting talking to you, and let's just say if you were in another part of the world and you're trying to tell someone about your community of Marshall, and maybe it's a good place to live or not, what would you tell them about Marshall in 25 words or less?
Well, I would tell them that Marshall is a pretty little town with lots of history, with lots of late 1800 building housing. A lot of old houses that have been maintained and add to the character of the town. Lots of trees, which add to the attractiveness of the town. It's a town that has a very attractive courthouse, a bandstand where the city band plays every Friday night during the summer and has for, I don't know how many years.
Since 1875.
1875. So it's a town that I think Illinois can be proud of, actually. Illinois kind of gets a bad rap for its politics and things like that, but Illinois can be a nice place to live, and Marshall is certainly a part of that.
Well, thank you, Steve. I really appreciate your time and your background. Several things I learned that I did not know before, and that's the whole idea of having some of this available for future people, in the future for people to look at and say, here's what took place in Marshall, and here's someone that was a part of it. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Damian.